unfolding across the Gulf is one of sudden escalation and brittle diplomacy, an episode that in the space of days has tested fragile ceasefires, reopened old fault lines and forced global trade and energy markets to reckon with the risk of wider conflict. On May 4th, 2026, the United Arab Emirates reported a series of drone and missile strikes that hit the eastern emirate of Fujairah. Officials said one of the attacks set ablaze a petroleum facility inside the Fujairah oil industry zone, one of the region's largest oil storage hubs and a vital point for tankers that seek to bypass the Strait of Hormuz. Local authorities said civil defense crews battled the blaze and that several foreign nationals were injured while responding to the scene. The attacks, which the UAE blamed on Iranian forces, came as the region watched a US-led naval effort move into the Strait of Hormuz to reopen a shipping lane that has been effectively closed to neutral shipping since the war began in late February. That naval initiative, announced publicly by the President of the United States on May 3 and put into action on May 4, under the name Project Freedom, was presented by the White House as an attempt to escort and clear commercial vessels stranded in the strait. The operation quickly became a focal point of the standoff. Tehran warned that any movement of ships through the waterway without its consent would be treated as a violation of a ceasefire arrangement that has repeatedly frayed over recent months. Washington framed the move as a humanitarian opening, a way to free grain, fertilizer and energy supplies long held up by the fighting, but Tehran and its regional allies called it provocation. Within hours of Project Freedom beginning, Tehran's military media published claims that Iranian forces had struck an American warship in the strait, forcing it to turn back. US Central Command responded swiftly and bluntly. No US Navy ships have been struck, the command said, stressing that American forces were supporting the operation and maintaining enforcement measures on maritime traffic in the region. At the same time, US military officials said they had engaged and destroyed several small Iranian fast attack boats that they said were being used to harass shipping lanes. Iran rejected those accounts and said it had compelled a US vessel to turn away, while regional maritime reporting centers and shipping companies described explosions and fires aboard commercial vessels in the theater. Across the Gulf, the UAE's defense ministry said its air defenses intercepted incoming projectiles and that operations were underway to protect civilian infrastructure. Several international partners, including Gulf states and European capitals, condemned the assaults on Emirati facilities and warned Tehran against further escalation. For shippers and insurers, the message was immediate and chilling. The alternatives to the Strait of Hormuz, including ports and bypass routes like Fujairah, were not necessarily safe havens. In Tehran, the country's top diplomat took to social media and international statements to underscore a different line, that the current flashpoints illustrated the limits of military solutions and that diplomacy, however tenuous, remained an avenue worth protecting. Iranian Foreign Minister Said Abbas Araqi framed the events as a warning against being drawn into wider fighting, and he urged restraint. Said Abbas Araqi said, Astaraxis events in Hormuz make clear that there's no military solution to a political crisis. As talks are making progress with Pakistan's gracious effort, the US should be wary of being dragged back into a quagmire by ill wishers. So should the UAE. Project Freedom is Project Deadlock. As Subnon Saad's conditionally is Project Deadlock. Those words were neither conciliating nor conciliating in tone. They were a public reminder that Tehran sees the strait as a strategic lever and that any external attempt to assert control without Iran's acceptance risks unraveling the fragile pauses that have held so far. Washington's language, by contrast, mixed urgency and firmness. In public remarks and in posts on his social platform, President Donald Trump positioned Project Freedom as both a practical rescue of stranded mariners and a clear signal the United States would not tolerate attacks on neutral shipping. He and his administration framed the move as one aimed at keeping global supply chains open, from crude oil and LPG to fertilizers and foodstuffs, goods critical not only to wealthy economies but to the basic needs of people across South Asia and beyond. President Donald Trump said, Asteriski did a little detour and it's working out very nicely. They have no Navy, they have no Air Force, they have no anti-aircraft equipment, they have no radar, they have no nothing. They have no leaders, actually. The leaders happen to be gone also, but can't let them have a nuclear weapon. And Esther Bado, whether read as bravado, Esti whether read as bravado or blunt deterrence. That passage underlined a central political and security argument in Washington that permitting Iran to retain or rebuild military and nuclear capabilities is unacceptable. The rhetoric, however, carries real operational risk. When senior commanders and political leaders describe enemy capabilities in terms that justify heightened action, opponents may react in kind using asymmetric means, such as drones, cruise missiles, and proxy attacks, that are designed to escalate friction while avoiding the traditional markers of naval or air combat. On the diplomatic front, Pakistan has been identified by several parties as a back-channel mediator attempting to preserve lines of communication between Tehran and Washington. Araghchi's reference to Pakistan's gracious effort points to a parallel diplomatic thread, a desire by some concerned states to prevent the shooting matches at sea from blowing up into a full return to all-out war. The ceasefire that had been brokered here, after weeks of increasingly intense strikes, has been described by participants as fragile and subject to rapid deterioration if either side perceives sharp violations. Those violations are exactly what many in the international community feared this week. The UAE described the strikes on Fujairah as a dangerous escalation, and the government reserved the right to respond to protect its territory and citizens. Gulf Cooperation Council members and several regional capitals issued condemnations. Global markets reacted immediately. Oil prices spiked as traders priced in the risk that crude export and refinery logistics could be disrupted for an extended period. At sea, commercial operators and insurers face a new calculus. For months, shipping companies had steered clear of the strait or paid premiums to teams that could arrange for protective passage in contested waters. With Project Freedom, at least some US flags and allied vessels attempted to transit under US escort. The conflict, a CAN commander said guided missile destroyers and other surface assets were in place to escort merchant ships and to protect freedom of navigation. Iranian commanders warned that ships moving through the strait without coordination with Iran would be treated as belligerent activity. The overlapping claims, the US assertion of a kind of protective freedom of navigation, and Iran's declaration of sovereignty and defense for its coastal approaches, created a recipe for dangerous miscalculation. Complicating the military picture are the economic levers now in play. The Treasury Department in Washington, charged with enforcing sanctions and exerting economic pressure, adopted a hawkish posture toward Tehran. The Secretary of the Treasury spoke publicly about measures the United States says are aimed at constricting Iran's ability to finance and sustain military operations. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said, "We say the Iranians do not have control of the strait. We have absolute control of the strait. We have blockaded the ships going into or out of Iranian ports. Their economy is in freefall, constant quest." Whether or not the precise phraseology tracks with actions on the water, the substance is clear: the US air government is attempting to assemble a combination of military protection for shipping and financial pressure on the Iranian state and its networks. Those tools are meant to operate in tandem, but their simultaneous use also risks hardening Tehran's resolve to leverage the strait and asymmetric strikes against energy infrastructure beyond Iran's shores. In the immediate aftermath of attacks on the UAE and the naval operation in the Strait, voices in capitals across the region emphasized caution. Allies of the United States spoke of solidarity with the UAE and support for maritime security. European and Asian governments urged restraint and called for renewed diplomacy. The United Nations and several humanitarian groups raised concerns about civilian casualty and the vulnerability of energy installations and transport that feed populations far beyond the Gulf. For the thousands of mariners and crews whose ships have been idle or burning off the cost of delay, the military and diplomatic theatre is a daily operational emergency. Fuel and food supply chains have rhythm and slack. When those rhythms are broken, shortages and price shocks ripple. Governments in the developing world warned that interruptions in LPG and fertilizer flows could have humanitarian consequences in coming weeks. As the shots and counterclaims flew, there was little ambiguity about one pressing strategic reality: the Strait of Hormuz remains a global choke point. It is a narrow maritime corridor through which an outsized share of the world's seaborne oil and petroleum products pass. Disruption there reverberates through markets, national budgets, and the everyday lives of people who rely on affordable fuel and food. That is why so many actors, from navies to Finn, and ministries to insurers, have a stake in the outcome. At the same time, the crisis underlined the way modern wars between states spill across geography and into trade, diplomacy, and economies. Attacks that once might have been confined to battlefields now appear on commercial shipping manifests and insurance contracts. Financial penalties are used as strategic tools. Back-channel mediators with narrow political space try to hold together threads of negotiation. The result is a complex theatre in which kinetic operations are embedded in economic and diplomatic campaigns. What happens next will depend on a small set of variables that remain painfully hard to control. Whether Iran chooses to broaden attacks on ports and energy infrastructure or instead to concentrate on naval harassment, whether Project Freedom will be enlarged and multilateralized by other navies, whether the fragile diplomatic channels, the ones the Iranian foreign minister credited to Pakistan, can be kept open long enough to produce a tangible de-escalation, and whether the calculus in Tehran and Washington will tilt toward further confrontation or toward a negotiated return to calmer waters. For now, the ceasefire that had provided an uneasy pause is, in the words of several diplomats, on life support. The events of May 4 did more than ignite a blaze at an oil depot in Fujairah. They reopened the question at the heart of the entire confrontation: whether coercive pressure and military operations can be used to enforce political outcomes without triggering a broader, uncontrollable conflagration. To many analysts, the most dangerous element of the current moment is not any single strike, but the accumulation of them. The pattern where tactical actions, a missile intercepted here, a fast boat sunk there, a port facility damaged over there, builds towards strategic outcomes neither side fully intends. That is the essence of escalation. It need not be dramatic to be decisive. As this story continues to evolve, the lives caught in its wake, sailors on board trapped ships, oil workers in the storage zones, families in Gulf cities hearing the thunder of interceptions, will be the immediate human measure of whether statesmen and commanders can find an off-ramp. For now, the watchword remains vigilance, at sea, in capitals, and in the rooms where diplomats still talk. The fragile peace that has held since the first bombs fell in late February hangs by a thread, and the choices made in the coming hours and days will determine whether that thread holds or snaps. This account will continue as events on the water and in the capitals unfold. In the meantime, the strait remains the world's strategic bottleneck, and the risks of further escalation are real and present. We will follow every development, convey the facts, and listen to the voices shaping the decisions from foreign ministers and treasury secretaries to the crews at sea as the global community seeks once again sets to navigate out of another dangerous crisis.